feel so fortunate to get to be here with this group of just really experts in this field, nature play, and that we're bringing together Dr. Claire Warden with focus on bringing that evidence base to life. And then we have, Adam, I don't know, you can tell how many spaces you've built out at this point, how many trainings you've done. A few thousand. I know that I've sat in on two different trainings. They're 2.5 days, so we have all of an hour here that I'm sure we can get in all the information from those 2.5 day trainings, or some version of there. And then Scott, who has really focused on the reality that when we install these structures, that there's a lot of considerations around planning and zoning and compatibility and accessibility and all the things. And so with that, I gave a brief opening, but I just want to pass the mic to you all to further share a little bit of, introduce yourselves and share a little bit about what shows up when you think of nature play. How do you even define that? What are we talking about here?
Can I do this one? Okay, before we do that, I got to ask a question to everyone. By a show of hands, when you're thinking about your favorite thing that you did, whatever that was that you were just talking about, by the fingers on your hands, how many of the 5 senses were being hit in that action, in that activity? For me, it was easy. It was all 5. So everyone can show. All right. So it's a trick question. In order for it to be your favorite, it had to be a multi-sensory experience. It's the way our brains work. We don't remember these things unless it was a multi-sensory experience. Second question, how many of you had an adult with you in that experience? 1, 2. Fishing? Fishing, yeah? There's always, fishing's a common one. So one of the things, the hallmarks of the parent being there is that they were actually assisting you with risk. They were helping you. So what was yours? With the grown-up?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah. We were just discussing, we have animals everywhere growing up.
Yeah.
So you will always be like in communities with that, or fighting for it, or your parents were there, measuring the time and things like that.
Yeah, so the common theme is risk. In each of our experiences, there's an element of risk, and there's a full sensory experience, and that is the common theme between our favorite things. And I want you to think for a second about our schools and what our kids experience when they're there. I will promise you in most of our schools, 2 million acres of asphalt in U.S. school grounds. I will promise you that their favorite experiences aren't there. So, that said, my job, did you ask kind of how I define nature play? It is the things that you remember when you were a kid. It's the full sensory experience. It is conflict with my friends. It's wrecking their fort and stealing their stuff to make a better fort when they weren't there, figuring out when they weren't going to be there, and then figuring out how to resolve that later on. It was wet and dirty and messy, and it was a scrape on my knee, and the way of dealing with it was to rub the dirt in and then move on to the next thing. So all the authentic, real stuff, it was loose parts, it was messy, it was collaborative, and involved other people, and it involved senses and risk. So that's nature play for me.
Well, geez, that was so good. I forgot what the question was. I'm not sure. I think I'll maybe just tell you a little bit about my background. My background is in commercial playground manufacturing. I worked for a family-run steel, all welded, stainless steel, some plastic manufacturer. We sold that about 20 years ago. And I started doing safety audits. So when you ask me my favorite experience, I've been in compliance and enforcement for so long. I don't have a favorite. I just sort of go around sucking the fun out of everything that other people. But I think my intro to Adam was about 20 years ago in a major municipality. For both of us, they phoned me and said, hey, this community wants this nature-based playground. We want you to come and sit in the front row and just kill it. I'm not sure if I've ever shared that with you. And I remember sitting there going this is really good. This is really, really good. And then it was over. And I was like, this guy only talked for an hour. I could have sat here for a lot longer. and saying to the city, this is really something that is special and is good. And so I hope I can keep up with these other two, because I've heard both of them speak, and it is just fantastic and engaging. And with that, I will drop the mic and pass to you.
So I need to say something about Scott because he's too humble. So Scott's the inspector that you want, because when you're trying to accomplish something and it doesn't comply with the ASTM standard, Scott's the person who shows up and goes, I think I get what you're trying to do. So if you shorten that back and you move that a little bit and you widen the zone just a little bit, you'll pass everything. You're fine. So he was never the one who was there to get a kick out of shutting anything down. He was the one there to facilitate getting it through. And so whenever we've had an issue in some of these thousands of playgrounds, we call you. He's also sat on the standard writing committee. He was the co-chair of the Canadian committee. He's written, you were on the writing part for the accessibility standard for playgrounds. You do all the soul-sucking stuff, man.
I was happy to let him keep going, but anyway.
And we're going to dig more into the compliance and how that shows up.
Oh, my turn. Right, okay. I don't build playgrounds. My background is in education, in teaching, in research. And I suppose for me, the whole element of nature-based work is that we've got so bogged down in what we call it that we've actually forgotten that it's just everything. It's everywhere and it's all around you. But you have to kind of work out what your driver is at this conference, because the more people I talk to, the more they get worried about the semantics around it, right? So let me explain that a bit. So people say to me, I'm going to reconnect you to nature. So in my worldview, I don't know how you can reconnect yourself to something you're an integral part of. So you might have to reawaken, you might have to remember, but you can't reconnect because you're an integral part of this system which is the planet. So for me, my understanding is that lovely baby at the back is also a very important part of all of this, no problem at all. She's very welcome. The important part here is that you work out what you think. What is your ontology, your worldview on all of this? So mine is that I am utterly connected to everything around me. And so I am, as we all know, following COVID, as subjected to the smallness of a virus as anything else on the planet. So I think when I talk about nature-based play, it is about opening ourselves up. It's going to a place of unpredictability, where unexpected wonders fly by, where it can't be controlled and shouldn't be controlled, because it's in that place of complexity and variety that we stimulate the brain, that we get a completely absorbing experience for young children. And yes, it's all the things that Adam talks about. And yes, it could be that you're involving yourself on building structures, but I think there's also the simplicity of a moment where a baby touches a blade of grass or reaches out and feels the soil for the first time. So we sometimes overcomplicate nature play, where there's a purity there that I think we can revisit.
Claire, I can almost picture myself back in that space as a child as you're describing it. It's really lovely. And we're going to kick it off with you. We've named that you've transformed a lot of spaces. Paint us a picture of what it looks like. What a space looks like that does all the things that you were talking about, that stimulates all the sentences.
Can you hear me fine at the back? Are we good? Okay, I hate microphones. So as long as everyone can hear me, I'll carry on. For me, the problem with the question, no offense, the problem with the question is that it shouldn't look the same every time. That nature is different in different places, and it should be a reflection of the local landscape, and it should be really thinking through, and at this stage should be thinking through what's going to be alive in the next 50 years, not just what's going to be alive today, because the nomadic forests were nomads over thousands of years, and now it's going to be over 20 years. So the plant material that we plant today has to be thoughtfully placed to be alive in the next 50, so that's part of the picture. In terms of the play features, it's topography, boulders, it's turning trees sideways or upside down. It's really looking at what you see beyond there, what you think would have been there had we not messed it up, and then drawing together the best of that. When you talk to folks, whether it's here or in Kenya or in Italy or Belgium, Jakarta, about their favorite space, riparian buffers come up over and over again along the edge of the water. And it makes sense. This is what we're drawn to because this is where society, where people, where community grew. This is where the food was, the biodiversity was, the materials, that's where the life was. So it seems to keep on repeating the various different riparian buffers. That landscape seems to repeat itself in some of the things that the kids get attracted to the most.
As we build out more of these spaces, there's obviously a lot of benefits that come with it. Imagine many folks in this room are well versed on the benefits of nature. There's also unique benefits of play when we overlay play and nature. So Claire, share with us a little bit. I know this is an area that you know well. Like, what are the unique benefits that show up in this focus on nature play?
I think for me that the easiest way to really describe it, thanks very much. Okay, so the easiest way, I think for me, is that there's a wonderful play theorist called Tony Pellegrini. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of him, right? Tony Pellegrini talks about the continuums. I can't use that. Okay. So I'll stand. So the continuum of play starts over here, which is when you take your guiding star, which is what I use. So star is your space, your time, your adult role, and your resources. That's your guiding star. And it doesn't matter if you're influenced by Loris Malaguzzi and Reggio Emilia, or, Piaget, or whoever it is, whichever theorist you find inspiring, they will have changed those four elements, right? So, hold that in your head. At this end, you have non-play. So the space has been overly designed, right? The child voice, not there. The time, you've got 5 minutes and no more. The adult role, I'll stand right here above you to make sure you get that work done. And the resource, well, I know better than you, so I'll draw it and you can colour it in if you're lucky. That's here. That's non-play and doesn't have any really resonance with the work we should be doing with young children. Over here, as these guys over here now, we're in the world of pure play. Let's go back to the guiding star. Space, wherever you want. Time, as long as you like. Adult role, step back, often not there, and the resources were found and discovered, which is the loose parts you hear people talking about now. So, if that's the spectrum, where's nature-based play, would you suggest? Where should I be when I'm talking about nature-based play? Some people are pointing here, all right? Some people are pointing right smack bang in the middle. There are some programs that call themselves nature-based or nature play, but they actually sit almost here. Because when they go to the forest, they take a worksheet. That didn't kind of work. So when we're talking about nature play, it has to sit from this middle part of the spectrum to the far end. But a big part of my work is working with child rights. So if it's a child rights-based play, nature-based play, that's the materials you're using, then they need to be consulted. And when you ask children and you consult them about what do you think nature play is all about, it'll be an answer like Adam's, which will be, well, actually, I really want to go over there and climb that tree. Or actually, I want to go over there and put my feet in that puddle. And actually, I'm going to lie down under that bush for a while. Don't know how long, just what I want to do. That, when you listen to them, their programming, their creativity will guide you towards that far end, I think, of the spectrum. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, and as we move towards this side of the spectrum,
yep.
What starts to come up is, well, there's a lot of risk.
Oh, yeah.
And, that's dangerous, and a lot of concern. So, Claire, kick us off, and then you can soul-suck how we address the risks, Scott. After Claire turns in, we'll pass the mic.
Sure. So for me, I think we need to start changing the narrative. Because when people talk about risk, there's usually an intake of breath, there's usually a sense of fear. But actually, in my work, I don't want to take away the risk, actually. And oftentimes I'm increasing what people perceive to be risk, because that actually makes it, bizarrely, a safer place. Let me explain what I mean by that. When you're looking at hazards, a hazard is a thing that has the potential to cause harm. It's an unseen threat. Now, how many of you bothered to check whether or not the glass that you drank your water out of was BPA free? How many of you randomly put your food into Tupperware containers and then put it in the microwave, but not realizing that actually that's going to release those toxins into your food. So there are a lot of unseen threats that we are exposed to every day, like driving, that we accept. Now, let's go on to risk, all right? So if we take that phrase, risky play, I'm going to leave the physical risk for a minute because that's the most obvious. Let's frame the idea of there being intellectual risk-taking, all right? Now, I'd love one of you to write for me a risk assessment of the monumentally boring and dull programming that happens in many of the schools I go to early. I would love that. What is the harm of getting a child to sit down for 3/4 of their day? What is the risk of giving them monumentally boring programs full of worksheets? What about the fact that you're disengaging children from a long-term engagement in living and learning? Well, that is intellectual, right? And what you want to do is say intellectual risk-taking happens when you don't know the answer. It's a divergent way of thinking, not convergent, which means that you want to place a possibility. Guess where you find that? In the natural world. Because you cannot predict when a butterfly is going to fly by. You cannot stop the rain from falling or from the leaves growing. You can't control it. So for many adults, they find the work in the natural world threatening because you can't control it like you can do an indoor space. So intellectual risk-taking, really high. You want thinkers of the future. People are now beginning to examine what will be the children of what they're calling the Anthropocene, which is the human-driven next generation, which is we've just alluded to. You want people who are critical. You want people who are flexible. You want people who can think creatively. Those happen when you do intellectual risk-taking. Emotional risk-taking? Well, yeah, you know, that sense of what the Scandinavians call ikmahaven. Have you ever heard that phrase? Ice in your stomach, the nervousness before you're about to do something. That is how you're doing emotional risk-taking. And it's all about a sense of apprehension of taking the next step. Now, it could be that I feel emotionally or socially involved in risk-taking just by walking up to someone at this conference going, hello. That's emotional risk-taking. But I work with children who cannot do that because they don't involve and haven't had the experience of emotional and social risk-taking. Guess where that's easier? In the natural world. Yeah. Now let's go to the last one, which to me is the easy one. Physical risk-taking, to me, is the one where we need to really examine ourselves about our own perceptions of risk. So put your hand up if you climbed a tree when you were little. Anyone at all? Keep your hand up if there was a 2-foot rubberized mat beneath the tree when you climbed it. Not one of you. And yet that's what we're beginning to do with children, is put them in a position where we are over protecting their sense of risk-taking, their physical risk-taking. Yeah? Now, Helen Nebelong, a good colleague of ours, she would argue that by making things too simple, you actually increase hazard. So what she would say is if you have a tree, every branch comes out at a different angle. All right? There are different thicknesses. There are different gaps. So your brain is having to fully engage in the climbing process as opposed to a standardized climbing frame which has set gaps. And when you see children play on a lot of these play equipments, they seek the adrenaline because they then use it in an inappropriate way, which is usually to try and hang off backwards or to a double flip as they come down. So when you're looking at risk-taking, my urgency would be to say, think of all the domains of risk-taking: intellectual, social, emotional, and lastly, physical. Yep.
Thank you, Claire. Scott, you can expand on how it shows up in the built environment.
I can. I think I'll take the physical play part and run with it, because I think that's where we get into those play space, the formal play spaces that are in a school or in a park or in a licensed childcare. And then how did we get there? I think most of us could probably agree we're not in a day and age where we can have an asset where the public has access and not have it validated against some standard. And those of us that are in design, those standards sometimes feel constraining. And I think it doesn't have to be. It can be in certain instances. But let's just go through a few slides. So this is, in essence, our first playground, meaning the sand, right? And so someone lives inland and says, geez, my kids really enjoyed that time at the beach with the sand and the water. I don't have that where I live, so I'm going to build a sandbox. And then from there, we started to see the advent of physical apparatus placed into those sand play areas. So we see slides, we see climbing boulders, we see whatever it is. And then that evolves into the first part. Now, the first play spaces were actually going to be in Germany and in England, but the first in the United States was Golden Gate Park in San Francisco in 1887. And then in 1907, President Roosevelt said, hey, these things are so good, we need to have formal play spaces within walking distance from every boy and girl. Now, quiz. Does anyone know what that is? Maypole. Anybody know the nickname? Nickname was the giant stride. And so the idea was you would grab the handle, you would run and take flight. Anybody know what actually tended to happen? Which leads into letter C. You're chomping at the bit, Adam. So people would take the handle and they would fling the handle at the next person over. Whack. And I think it was banned by the National Recreation Association in 1948 because it caused 32 fatalities. This was the first piece of equipment specifically banned from use. Now it's sold under the same name, like a big umbrella nowadays, so it doesn't have that same movable element with the solid rod. But that is this is the advent of playground safety right here. And then how about that one? I heard Claire talk about the spin back, or what was commonly called the cherry drop, which the Consumer Product Safety Commission banned in 1981. You can't have a rung-to-rung distance any more than 18 inches because if the kids spin back, they would whack their head into the lower rung. But man, those things were awesome for hanging out on your lunch and whatever else.
Human Plinko.
And then in the early 90s, this is when these two agencies, the left is ASTM, the right is the Consumer Product Safety Commission. CPSC was driven by injury data. ASTM was more driven by mortgage backers that were having injuries in their community housing complexes that suggested that maybe these spaces ought to have some mechanism for safety. So maybe they were fun, but they weren't so safe. And then all of a sudden they went from fun to maybe overly safe. And so after these guys come and get involved, playgrounds start looking like this. You see primary colors, you see those elevated platforms that I heard Claire talking about, where kids would stand and then potentially turn their brains off, even climber rungs, all those sorts of things. And this was my world for 20 years. In 2010, ADA came involved, and not only did we have those same set of safety constraints, but then we also needed to provide mobility device access. And I think the big one, I think that concept of inclusion, everyone would agree with. The problem, I think, is that how that gets done may not work super awesome. And at this point now, ADA is 14 years old. You don't think in those 14 years or in the 20-year standards have been around, well, imagine if tax law didn't change in 15 years, all the loopholes that would exist. And those do exist now. So more towards the modern area, we see a lot of playgrounds designed with big heights. This is more of a concept coming from Europe. The lower level there is the ADA. So with ADA, you need to have so many components. For every component you have up high, it works out directly. Every 3 components you have elevated, you got to have 1 down low. And the bigger that playground gets, we just need to put more and more down low. And that's how ADA gets a compliant check mark from a compliance perspective. And then this is one of Adam's. We can do that out of natural products, whether it's commercial, posted platform, natural materials. Either one of those can comply. We can meet ASTM, CPSC, and ADA, and you can see that accessible walkway going through the center of that photo right there. Just a few different ones that you can see, and again, I think a natural playground, at least from an ADA perspective, has a hidden advantage because most of the elements typically are lower to the ground. We have that ground level accessible route getting there and away. This one was an interesting one. This is one of the first sites Adam and I had in common. And I just kind of said, hey, Adam, look, you got this climber going up the side of this hill. The kids might climb up there and fall onto the asphalt. And he said, you're kidding me, right? And he said, that's a retainer. And And I said, well, that's pretty smart, actually. Retainers are exempt. And I can see the light bulb go on for me. And I think normally, now this was a play space I saw probably about a week ago. It's not finished construction yet, but that is typically what a retainer looks like. Nothing exciting about that. Agreed? So then Adam decided he would start making sandboxes, knowing that the retainer was exempt. And he said, hey, if I make this retainer a little bit more exciting, as long as I don't build these things 8, 10, or 12 feet high over a compacted surface, I am exempt from ASTM entirely. And I said, yeah, great. If I make a bench that is a little more exciting, doesn't necessarily make it a balance beam. This is when we get into some of the things like nomenclature, where if we call it a balance beam, it will be subject to height requirements. If we call it a bench, again, it is exempt. And as long as we don't do things that are, frankly, dumb, like build it 5 or 6 or 10 feet in the air without some kind of railing or hand support, we are exempt from ASTM or CPSC. This one always makes me chuckle. You pay more for a fake tree than you do for a real tree. And there's something that we'll always find humorous in that. Let's talk a little bit about injuries before I pass the mic back. Okay, so we have about 200 to 250,000 injuries a year. 79% are from falls. It sounds bad. It sounds like we're going to do something. But if we take a step back and just look at hospitalization society-wide from falls, that number is 70%. So only 9% higher when it's in a playground environment. Not a significant jump. When we go down to the bottom, we look at 21% are from these other areas. Impact is just people running into things. Entanglements and entrapments have dropped about 75% in the last 20 years. So although there are areas of standards I think can be constraining, in general, I think they work at limiting the life-threatening, what we would call the serious type injuries, which are the ones most of us would be on board with. It's some of the finer minutiae we would sort of like to shake some of those constraints off. Okay, so how many times do people actually get hurt? So based on that 200 to 250,000 a year, that works out based on the number of places in the United States, so about 1.12% per year. And that's just people that walk into the emergency room. Those that we would call serious injuries are about 0.08% per year. So it's kind of hardly a thing. This one is where I'm going to pass the mic back. This is the last playground I ever sold in 2006. They just took the fence down for the grand opening. That's my son. He survived. He's now driving age. But you can see, and he is not the first child to climb that tree. I think I showed this to Adam and I said, hey man, like this tree is really, really popular. It's starting to lean. He said, hey, let the kids go. That's a good death. Because it is the most popular element in that park and still is to this day. And so with that, I will pass that back.
So we're deep in conversation about risky play and how we respond to that. Maybe Adam, you can respond to risky play, but I also want to respond to something that's coming up about how we factor in ways to navigate code compliance while also being really mindful of accessibility. Could you share with us maybe, as you talk about risky play, speak to that?
Accessibility? Mm-hmm. Sure. First, I got to talk about this for 1 second.
Yep.
So a couple things about this. We did this in order to get the grown-ups to bring their kids to this thing. We also had sand and water at this. So where do you think all the kids spent their time? They were all over the sand and water. That full sensory indulgence. You wanted to go where parents were like, get me out of here. My kid's not leaving. And we actually had to put activities outside of the space because it would not leave the sand and water. There were sand tables. So that there were opportunities for the grandparents mostly who were with mobility devices there to actually interact with their children, and those sand tables were splitting the space with the sand and water. This was used twice and they were bored. I've done this. It's over for me. I need to go on to the next thing. So I just wanted to mention that this was the most expensive thing by a long shot, but certainly not the main thing. I also want to just mention around the ASTM, things I've learned from Scott. Furniture stands outside of the standard. The retaining wall, between those two spaces or the structure around the edge stands outside of the standard. Ecological restoration stands outside of the standard. Sculpture usually stands outside of the standard as well. Intended use matters. So we need to be able to think about that when we're doing this work. For those who are worried about the risk, I believe we're more worried about the lawsuit than we are about the risk, the risk injury. If there's a way to have children have these positive associations with injury and actually have that effect but not get sued, I feel like there'd be a lot less likelihood. In the places like Berlin where it's illegal to sue for those injuries because that's the kid's fault and he should just figure it out. There's all kinds of crazy risky things. The interesting part is the injury rates are not higher but lower in those places where they're not following some of these rules. We have done 3,500 of these spaces so far. We have never, ever had a claim of injury on any of our spaces. I sat on the systematic lit review for outdoor risky play. We measured where so this is the paper, anyone heard about the risky play, the idea of risky play? Yeah. So that's all coming out of Ellen Sandsetter's work, and there's a group of people who did that research. What we discovered is that your better predictor of injury is whether or not your head's in the game than whether you're present than the equipment and the surface. The less sensory, this goes back to that first conversation, the less sensory your play is, the higher the risk of injury. You want to test to see whether or not those kids are going to get injured, track how many times their tongue sticks out, and you will get there. So you know what tongue sticking out is? That moment when your tongue's sticking out means you're fully in. You're in the moment. That only happens if your senses are engaged. So not surprisingly, 9 times more likely to actually have an injury when you're on monkey bars than when you're climbing the pine tree. Because the pine tree is smell and sense, and you're figuring out where your hand is on that branch. And when you go back and you're a different size, the next year you have to recalculate everything again. If you make it static, if you make it non-sensory, you also increase your injury rates alongside of that. So next thing I'll quickly just tell you, the stuff below 3 feet, we discovered that when you look at all the papers around where the injuries actually happen, that stuff up to 1 meter high, this is why in the European standard they don't really care what happens below that meter. Like, you can put cobblestone underneath that. They just don't, it doesn't matter. Actually, in Berlin saw trampolines with cobblestone as the surface between the trampolines and the ground in public space, which I loved. I'm not saying we should do that. I'm just saying that's you get to see stuff like this in places where there is no lawsuit that follows. If you're looking at this table height and below, we're not seeing any statistical bump in injury regardless of that surface. So we have to stop thinking about all of this stuff as a risk, no matter how high. That's why we started carving benches like crazy. I remember the conversation with Scott around the spiral bench. He's like, that's a balance beam. I said, no, it's a spiral bench around a tree. And he went, okay. And we don't have injuries there. Now, I will say there's a number of kids who misuse that thing. They seem to do balance beam stuff on it. I don't know. Not my fault. It's clearly a bench. They should sit. So when it comes to accessibility, I think it's an important conversation.
Can I try tackling something on that accessibility piece?
Yeah.
Well, continue on, or you
want me to? No, I just want to hit one quick thing. In terms of our perspective on accessibility, let's think about what the optimal experiences are for optimal child development for our kids. What are those optimal experiences? For all people, there are a number of optimal experiences that we have to seek, and then let's figure out how to make them accessible. Let's not pave everything and cut out all of the optimal experiences so that we can actually now say that everything's accessible. What actually ends up happening is that nothing is. We no longer have any cool stuff to play with. We have no sensory material because it can't live in that environment. We have heat island effect that blows up the heat scores on that to the point where it's too hot to go there because you can't have trees, and now it's all superheated. We have benzene off-gassing and volatile chemical off-gassing like we've never seen before, We haven't achieved anything because now no one wants to go to this playground because it sucks. So let's think about what doesn't suck. Let's think about the optimal experiences, and then let's think about how to make those accessible. And in every case, that's slightly different. It might just be that we have to change the grades in the right way, that we have a 5% slope to the place of perspective. But all of that is alive. We have to think about how we're dealing with water flowing through those spaces, but still making them ADA compliant. We have to think about how to put the plant material up against the sides of the pathways and right into the face of people so that they're touching and feeling this thing regardless of where they are seeing the world from. Because if we keep on pulling things back because forestry practice says this, or because if we put it too close, it's going to make that pathway buckle in 25 years, I don't care. In 25 years, are you kidding me? Plant the thing right there so that everybody of every ability can interact with that thing and smell it and pick the berries, make it fruit, make it messy, and you'll have more kids interested and more kids interacting regardless of ability. But right now we actually clean things up way too much for the sake of maintenance and a fear of it not being considered accessible, when the reality is that we can do all kinds of things to get people, but we have to focus on the experience first and accessibility second.
Well, I think if I can just piggyback on that, and I don't mean to pick on Topher, but I saw you roll in. If you want me asking, if something is ADA compliant, does it always make it accessible or good?
No.
Right. So the comment was no, right? And so, meeting ADA is meeting a minimum standard of accessibility, right? And so really what we want to push for is that universal design or inclusion, right? And so those are not all, when ADA was written specific to play spaces, 2010, the definition of disability was 4% of society. Well, now that definition of disability is expanded to 15%, because we count things like eyeglasses, cochlear implants, different things on the autism spectrum. And so you don't think some of that stuff in ADA is dated after 14 years? Like, it absolutely is, and needs a potential refresher, right? But then sometimes I think there's pushback from industry, and sometimes that's fair because they're like, it's workable, right? It's a workable set of rules. Should it be better? Should it be worse?
I don't want a workable marriage. We're going to be better than workable.
Right.
God.
So then how do you regulate that? And that is the tough one, and I don't have an answer for that one. Any comments? Yeah.
Sometimes ADA takes away the risk, too.
Another comment was, ADA takes away the risk. And one thing I've picked up on, too, is people with, mobility device issues don't want to be told what they can and can't do. You just got to get them there. And they'll figure out what they... Fair?
Yeah, and then there's technology that's coming along.
Yeah.
And that's what's actually getting us to be able to play with everybody.
Right.
Like the bikes.
Yeah, we worked on one recently, $11 million spent on a spectacular natural playground. And we went through the entire school body. And we did an assessment of everybody's different ability. And it turned out that there's one child, Nico, who's in a wheelchair. He has an injury that won't allow him from mid-waist down. And he's like, I don't want you guys to make everything rubber. I want to be where everybody else is. So we said, okay, and we talked to everyone about it. We bought him an all-terrain chair that gets him across the grass, gets him into everything, and that saved on that project. It put into risk and play about $850,000 that we didn't have to spend on that, and we made an agreement that we'll buy mobility devices that work for anyone who wants to come to that school for the next decade. Because it turns out that that's less money than screwing up the landscape, and everyone's disability, it turns out, is quite different from the next person's. So each device has to be slightly different in order to make that work. And that became a much more valuable conversation. You see Nico's now screaming back and forth all over the place in this place. He's also the meanest, angriest, most difficult kid I've ever met. I love this kid. Everyone followed him. So maybe we need some different perspective on
I think
what it is.
The other one on rubber, before we leave, I think we had a question in the back too, but the other thing I always find odd is that if you ever watch that port in place rubber get put in, you ever watch the installers? What are they wearing? Like a hazmat suit, right? And then they walk away, and you open it for play, and it's like, somehow this makes sense. I don't know, man.
At 3 feet on that day, that measures at 3 times the allowable carcinogen rate for benzene off-gassing. At 3 feet. Where are those children, majority of those children, interacting with that stuff? And it's 2 inches, and we don't have that measurement because the measurement's taken at 3 feet off the ground. And by the way, in 5 years, that's all chipping and splitting, and you're fixing that and troweling over and spending your money anyway. So there's lots of other ways to do it. It's not easier or cheaper.
Adam and Claire have given us some really, lots to think about already, some insight on the benefits of play, how it shows up, nature play shows up, and then some considerations for design and creation. What are questions that are emerging for you all? I'm going to run around a bit and field your questions.
I need that while
Thank you.
I usually have a really good outdoor voice that I'm not going to use right now. So I have kind of a dual question, I guess. So we support a lot of programs. I'm not an landscape architect, so we don't do design. We do vision processes using NLI's approach. And we use the CPSC guidelines because it's my understanding, Scott, there is nothing else for childcare programs. Are you aware of a better?
Yeah, so I think when depends on the state you live in. So usually state licensing.
Ours is terrible. It's a half a page. It will be safe.
Right. Okay. And most of them are terrible, but usually each state would either specify CPSC or ASTM. But I mean, if you're looking for guidance on one specific ability that you need to enhance, you're going to get really, really minimal information. And I think as we talked about, Adam talked about, you know, the change from 4% of society being what we would call having mobility issues or adaptive needs to 15%. Well, in any one space, you really want to try to cater to that need, and I don't think you're going to ever find that in the CPSC or any standard guideline, nor should we, I think. Is that?
Yeah, totally. And
So,
then my kind of follow-up question.
I want to jump in a bit. You can also start to adapt the RBA, a risk-benefit analysis.
Yeah.
So you can do that. Tim Gill, managing risk through play provision in the UK, and that's a different framework. I should say about that 15%, the fastest rising disability in that section of increase is not mobility in the sense that we call it. That is sensory integration issues. That's Asperger's spectrum and autism, which, by the way, again, the solution for the best thing you can do is have a full sensory experience. I hate to keep on harping on the sensory experience. That is what people who are experiencing those disabilities need as therapy.
And I think in terms of how you navigate that with standards is there's this thing in the back. It's in ASTM, not CPSC, unfortunately. Now, there's a new CPSC coming out in the fall, but there's this thing in the back called it's called a hazard identification and risk assessment. Adam's talking about the same thing on an ISO level. It's gone to benefit risk assessment, but it's a way to work around the clauses. Like instead of I showed those tower structures, you never get exempted from this 6 foot or 9 foot use zone. But if you say, hey, you know what, in occupational health and safety, we do this through enclosure and harnessing. And this is the same concept done in this tower. You can see the kids can't get out. And so you can then sort of navigate and stick handle around some of those rules through that risk-benefit assessment. And that was really standards agencies deciding they couldn't keep up with design. And rather than making the standard bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, they just said, hey, if you address these risks and hazards, you can do whatever you like.
Can I come in just with the voice of the child a bit there and say that for me, sometimes people get really obsessed about their risk assessments. And for me, they're more of a document that permits riskier play rather than prevents it. But it bothers me that often they're put into a folder and then they're put on a wall or they're put into a Google Doc, and they're not a living document. And so what I mean by that is, when is the voice of the stakeholder in your risk management process? Because you're the one that's thought through all these different things, but actually it's the child's voice that needs to be in there. So for us, we have lots and lots of different risk assessments, and they're all there, but the back of them, all of them, is us having a conversation with children about what's great about doing this, what's the tricky things, how are you going to keep yourself safe. So, you know, the good, the tricky, and how you're going to keep yourself safe. Because they have to understand and be aware of, cognitively, some of the things they're going to encounter. And I would far rather go down that route than prevent something or stopping something from happening.
Yeah, I think that's the whole compared to what. Every time you're stuck in this, you need to do a compared to what. We seem to look at play and playgrounds with some other light, like if they're not playing in playgrounds, there will never be an injury. That is nonsense.
Yeah, we had a drag creek bed we installed, and, well, the site installed it, I wasn't there, but we recommended it for a drainage issue. They put it in, a licensing specialist told them someone could throw a rock and kill someone. I was like, wow, you have really strong 3-year-olds if they're going to kill somebody with a rock. And then so they called me panicking because it was the day before they were supposed to open. And I said, how about you call them back and ask them about the blocks in your block play area?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And licensing backed off real quick.
And we've had fire issues where they say, well, what about, you got sticks, what about fire? And I'm like, man, if they can rub them together and get fire, they are going to give them a gold medal. And if that's the case, you better get rid of those books, because that's paper. You know, so it's got to be a compared to what. There's a lack of logic that gets applied to a lot of these things. And the other thing I'll say about your CPSC, it's not about the document, it's about the human being that enforces the document. So there are inspectors out there who didn't get into the police academy who are taking it out on us. And there are some of those, I'll put it out there. I'm not probably insulting someone directly right now, and I apologize. And there are also some people, and this is why I respect Scott, in the industry who are genuinely interested in child development, who are genuinely interested in that, and you can demand another inspector. And I would push back on those that don't make sense and demand another inspector, because at this point we're right. And just for a quick note on stats, we are, whether you're looking at Cornell's, Ithaca's, some of the stuff out of Winnipeg, not my personal stats, we are 30 to 39 times, that's 3,000 to 3,900% less likely to have a hospital visit playing on a natural play space that's fully sensory than plastic and steel and rubber. 39 times. It's not close. We're talking about like a distance between these things. So the fear that we're saying, that stat that you said where they are in the spectrum, on either side of playground injuries are fishing and sailing. And if we applied this rule of any injury is a bad injury, we would have to stop at 175 times more likely football, hockey, soccer, everything we bring our kids to is 100+ times more likely to cause those injuries. Gymnasiums are terrible. In fact, if you follow the stats, you should put a playground in every gymnasium, the injury rates would go down.
It's totally true. Yeah.
Yeah, good. What other questions are surfacing?
Well, I was just going to say, I really appreciate this conversation around risk. It just, to me, there's just an irony, because I think personally that one of the riskiest things that we let youth do today is spend all this time on screens. Mm-hmm. And they're on screens in school, they're being advertised to by technology companies, all these, their data is being harvested, all these risky things, and adults are totally missing in that conversation about the risk. And so I just appreciate the framing of the intellectual risk, and I think we need to really have a national conversation about what is really risky. I mean, of course, there's cars and football and all these other things, but we're also letting our kids be on devices all day long, and the mental health and the emotional health and the physical, lack of getting physical activity is just huge. So I really appreciate the conversation and how we can try to shift that thinking.
Well, Jonathan Haidt's book that just came out, The Anxious Generation, I knew Jonathan from before we spoke at length. I was able to see the chapters before they came out. What was interesting about that book, there's that $11 million project, there's a picture of it in the 10th chapter or something. What's interesting about that is that, yes, okay, ban social media from schools. That's enough. We know it's causing harm. We know they're losing concentration. Ban that. But you can't just do that. You have to give them something to replace that. There has to be something to fill that void, or the anxiety will go through the roof. It'll be an impossible thing to manage. because this is like taking people off. This is taking people off an addiction. So and his research and his book writes about the alternative is every single school should have its own forest, because then you would have a place to go once you aren't on your screen that actually filled the void. So it's not enough just to say no to the bad stuff. We got to provide something better.
We're going to take one more question, then we'll have our speakers close out. Any questions?
Hi. So my name is Elisa Yair. I'm from Washington State, and I was the specialist for the outdoor preschool licensing pilot. So we have in Washington State now a systemic licensing standards around natural spaces that rely on the benefit risk assessment process. And one of the things, though, that I'm curious about from your perspective is when I think about, somebody looking at something like that and being fearful, I think about how maybe they just don't know what it's like, right? And I'm considering how many of us are disconnected from knowledge about how to even keep ourselves safe near water, with fire. So I'm wondering if you can speak to not just like rules for kids, but sort of engaging adults in their own sense of safety.
Sure. I think what's happened is the detachment and isolation, and of all of us as a human species, if I talk generally about it. I think one of the things that I find fascinating is this concept of reductionism. And so with reductionism, what we've done over time as human beings is to reduce the complexity and the beauty and the risk and all this stuff of the natural world, and we've containerized it, we've reduced it down to say, this is the only type of flower that's worth anything. It's called a daffodil, it's on the table. We put it in shops like IKEA and say, this is the nature you should have. So you're absolutely right. That, what I would call embedded knowledge, the knowledge that many First Nation peoples I work with have still got and have always had, all of us had, but we haven't had a need to use it because we've put ourselves in a position of being an indoor dweller and decorating ourselves with biophilic design principles. So a number of people have been talking to me about Laura Smiley-Guzzi and the work in Reggio Emilia. I said, yeah, but it's biophilic design principles. That's what they're doing, is using the palette, the colour we've got, putting a plant in a plant pot. Well, you don't need to worry about the plant in a plant pot. It's not a triffid, so you control it. And as human beings, we reduce down those things that cause us to have any form of fear. So putting ourselves in a place where we're now in that learning zone is scary. And I found it when I first went to Australia, because it turned out I ended up in a place where anything could kill me. And I was only used to hedgehogs in Scotland, that's it, midges. So it's good to put yourself back in a place of being a learner and to feel that disequilibrium that comes from being a learner, actually. So when you look at the adults who traditionally work, especially in the early years, they're not always big risk embracers, yeah? So when we look at training, that's why you have to do the stuff like these guys are doing workshops outside. I would say we need to go a step further than saying, I'm not being horrible now, but, here's a table, let's put some rocks on it, let's play with the rocks. You've containerized and reduced nature to rocks on a table, yeah? That's a different thing to being out in a mountain with the rain lashing on your face and you're a bit uncertain about where you are. That's a very different experience. So maybe we need to start programs of training and development which shift adult perception so they really are truly learning in that space and not just playing with a few rocks. Sorry to be contentious. But that's my view.
We're coming up on time, and I'm going to cheat a little bit and just make the decision that we're going to go a little bit over.
Oh, I know.
For a minute, because I actually have a piggyback question that's personal for me that relates maybe to this. I have a 15-year-old. We think of play. Probably immediately our brains go to small children. We know from research that play is important continuously.
Yeah.
And so maybe I would ask each of you, to everything you've spoken to, what adaptations, if any, would you say show up as you start to think of the opportunities we have to support play at different ages, including those older youth?
I'll come in up first if you like. I mean, I think for me, it's about seeing your mates, because if your peer group are engaging in that thing, then if all of a sudden it's okay. So we believe as adults we're important, but actually I don't think you are. I've got 3 teenagers, and so actually you have to then look at what's the situation around those children that makes them even want to engage. And although we've been really critical of media during COVID, it was really interesting to see the power actually of technology. So the Scottish Government funded us to do something called the Virtual Nature School, which sounds ridiculous. You can find it on YouTube. And it was literally me in a forest with a group of children we were looking after. Sorry, not looking for, I didn't lose them. And so I beamed out from this shed in the forest, and the children who engaged actually were the older children. And although it was designed for children who couldn't attend school from 5 to 11, you found that actually it was the older brothers and sisters that actually would come online. So they'd have a 20-minute, here's a challenge, frame it up, go away, go play, come back and have lunch with me. All of it was done digitally. So because their mates were online and because we were doing it outside, it kind of worked. So for me, it's about making it easy, but making it trendy. Yeah, making it something they see their mates do.
Yeah, I mean, I think the play changes over time, right? I mean, you start, so the little one whose name I've forgotten already, which is terrible.
Oh, Layla?
Layla. I was going to say Lily, and as it was coming to me, I'm like, this is wrong. I've got it wrong. From Layla's age throughout, the way in which we play changes, and as our kids get older, they get more social in their cliques. And so when we're designing a space, we're thinking of pockets that are going to be used by groups of kids that are in smaller groups, 2, 3, 4 at a time, so that it's not all just, we keep on talking about play like it's just gross motor, large muscle group. That is nonsense. It is gross motor, it is creative dramatic play, it is just as important is fine motor, so manipulating things and moving things and making things, and it is quiet contemplative space. 80% of the physical activity that's happening in our playgrounds right now is being performed by 20% of the people who are there. So when you look at a plastic and steel one, 20% are doing 80% of the activity, and they're the fit, A-type, king of the castle, queen of the castle. The ones that you would most want to just calm down. They're already fit. They don't need this. If you shift this to sensory and nature play, you get a broader spectrum that divides up by ability, not age. So that's part of this. So you'll end up in the sensory environments where you've created these pockets. You end up with groups of children that are not necessarily just the 14-year-olds with the 14-year-olds. There's a 14-year-old who's into climbing the boulder with a 7-year-old who's into climbing the boulder, and their ability range is the same. And if you create different pockets that can be completely discrete from one another and put buffers between those, they start to play based on ability. But the thing that seems to be missing most for kids to have agency is the other 3 categories: creative dramatic, quiet contemplative, fine motor, which are just as important to play as the gross motor piece.
Yeah.
Only thing I'd add in closing, and of course I'm going to come at it from a boring standards perspective, is that these, standards written by adults say that if you're under 2, you play in this one and you comply with this standard. If you're 2 to 12, you're over here. And if you're over 12, you're an illegal monster and you're not even allowed anywhere near it. And those labels are just so dumb. Right? Like, I honestly associate it with Lego. It'll say 9 to 14 and your 6-year-old fires it together in no time. And I would love to see those come off. Like, even when standards first came out, they just said preschool, school age, and other people. And it would be more ability-based, as Adam alluded to. Unfortunately, it is not that way. I've been involved in lawsuits where those age labels have cost me money or gotten me out the door. But irrespective of that, I think it's dumb.
Yep.
Claire, Scott, Adam, you've given us a lot to think about for case making, for planning and design, for creating spaces that are full sensory. Thank you so much for your insights. Really appreciate it. I know they'll be around for a little bit if you want to ask any questions following, but we're going to close out. Thanks for staying a little bit longer. Appreciate it.